There's a moment most traders recognize, even if they've never said it out loud. You're about to take a trade that doesn't quite fit. The size feels slightly heavier than usual. The context isn't clean, but your mind is already working. Not to stop you, to explain why this time is different. This is how risk is justified. Not with numbers, not with logic, but with language. It often starts quietly, a sentence that feels reasonable, measured, almost responsible. I've earned the right to press this. It's still within my tolerance. I understand the risk. What's happening here isn't recklessness, it's rationalization. And the reason this matters is because rationalization feels like discipline. It sounds like control. It borrows the vocabulary of professionalism, but it isn't the same thing. Most traders don't blow up because they ignore risk. They blow up because they explain it away. I've seen this pattern repeat across experience levels. Beginners do it clumsily. Experienced traders do it elegantly. The more time you spend in markets, the better you get at narrating your own behavior. That narration becomes dangerous when it replaces structure. There's a specific psychological shift that happens before risk expands. It's not excitement. It's not fear. It's justification. Justification is subtle. It doesn't announce itself as a mistake. It presents itself as maturity. You're no longer saying, I want this trade. You're saying, this makes sense. That distinction matters. Because once something makes sense, resistance fades. The mind stops checking. It starts confirming. You selectively remember past wins that support the decision. You downplay losses as different circumstances. You emphasize context over rules, and you call it discretion. This is where many traders get confused. They think discipline fails when emotions spike. In reality, discipline fails when emotions become articulate. When the internal dialogue sounds calm, measured, professional, that's when risk quietly stretches. Not all at once. Incrementally, a slightly wider stop, a slightly larger size, a trade taken earlier than planned. Each decision defensible on its own. Together, they form a pattern of permission. I want to be precise here. Risk justification is not about ignorance. It's about familiarity. The more familiar you are with uncertainty, the easier it becomes to coexist with it. And coexistence feels like mastery. You tell yourself you've seen worse. That volatility doesn't scare you anymore. That you can handle drawdown. Those statements might even be true, but truth isn't the same as alignment. What's often missing in these moments is not courage, it's constraints. When traders talk about confidence, they rarely mention boundaries. Confidence without boundaries turns into negotiation. And negotiation always favors the moment. I've noticed that traders rarely justify risk when they're calm and flat. They justify it when something is already in motion. After a win, after a loss, after a stretch of activity, the justification is a response, not a plan. It's a reaction dressed up as reasoning. Listen closely to the language used during these moments. You don't get these setups often. This is a high-quality exception. I will manage it actively. Each phrase reduces friction. Each phrase lowers the internal barrier. And none of them are rules. Rules don't negotiate. They don't adapt to mood or context. Justifications do. This is why justification feels empowering in the short term and destructive over time. It allows you to act while still feeling responsible. It preserves your self-image as a disciplined trader, even as behavior drifts. That's the core tension. Most traders don't want to be reckless. They want to feel competent. Justifying risk is how competence is protected when structure is violated. And the more intelligent and self-aware a trader is, the more convincing the justification becomes. That's the trap. You're not fighting impulsivity. You are negotiating with intelligence. And intelligence, when unbounded, can rationalize almost anything. Before we talk about control, it's important to sit with this recognition. If you've ever looked back at a loss and thought, I knew better, but it made sense at the time, you've already seen this mechanism at work. That sentence is the signature. It made sense at the time. That's not a failure of knowledge. It's a failure of structure. And structure is what we'll turn to next. If you find yourself recognizing these moments, consider staying connected to this channel. Subscribing isn't about signals or performance. It's a quiet way of aligning with a trading identity built on restraint, structure, and long-term psychological clarity. To understand how traders justify risk, you have to understand what the brain is trying to protect. It's not capital, it's coherence. The human mind is deeply uncomfortable with internal contradiction. When your rules say one thing and your impulse says another, tension appears. That tension demands resolution. Most traders assume resolution comes from better discipline. In practice, it often comes from reinterpretation. You don't break the rule, you redefine it. This is where justification lives. The brain reframes behavior so that identity remains intact. I'm not over-risking, I'm adapting. I'm not impulsive, I'm responsive. I'm not breaking rules. This rule doesn't apply here. Notice how the self-image stays clean. This is cognitive consistency at work. Once you understand that, justification stops feeling like a moral failure and starts looking like a system flaw. The system being your decision architecture. I've found that traders with vague rules justify risk more often than traders with strict ones. Not because they're weaker, but because ambiguity invites interpretation. If your risk framework includes phrases like around, usually, or when it feels right, you've already created space for negotiation, and the mind will use it. Another important mechanism here is delayed consequence. Risk justification feels safe because consequences aren't immediate. You increase size, nothing happens. You widen a stop, price reverses back in your favor. The brain logs these outcomes as validation. It doesn't log the behavior. It logs the result. Over time, this trains confidence in the justification itself, not in the process. This is why traders often say, it's been working. What they mean is, I haven't been punished yet. Markets are particularly good at reinforcing bad processes. They don't care about your rules. They respond to probability. So when justification coincides with a favorable outcome, the brain strengthens the pattern. That's not luck. That's learning. But it's learning the wrong lesson. Another layer here is emotional accounting. After a loss, traders feel a need to make it back. After a win, they feel permission to press advantage. In both cases, risk expansion is justified by emotional balance sheets. I'm still up on the day. I need to recover this drawdown. These statements sound logical. They're emotionally driven. They tie risk to recent outcomes instead of predefined limits. That shift is subtle but critical. Risk becomes dynamic based on feeling, not static based on structure. Once that happens, justification becomes constant. Every decision requires explanation. Every trade becomes contextual, and context is infinite. There's always a reason. I want to emphasize something here. Justification is not lying to yourself. It's believing yourself. That's why it's so effective. The internal narrative is coherent. The arguments are well-formed. The tone is calm. From the inside, it feels like control. From the outside, it looks like drift. This is why telling traders to be more disciplined rarely works. Discipline isn't the absence of justification. It's the inability to act on it. That inability comes from constraints that don't require interpretation. When I've watched traders change this behavior, it wasn't through insight alone. They didn't suddenly see the light and stop justifying. They removed the decision point entirely. That's the pivot. Risk justification thrives in moments of choice. Eliminate the choice, and justification has nowhere to attach. This is the difference between rules and protocols. Rules describe behavior. Protocols enforce it. A rule says, I don't risk more than X. A protocol says, if X is exceeded, the trade cannot be placed. No debate. No narrative. Justification doesn't disappear because it's challenged. It disappears because it's irrelevant. This understanding reframes the problem. You're not trying to become more honest with yourself. You're trying to build an environment where honesty isn't required for safety. That's a subtle but powerful shift. The goal isn't self-control. It's system control. And that brings us to the final layer. Control doesn't begin with stronger willpower. It begins with fewer decisions. If justification is the problem, then discretion is the fuel. So the solution isn't emotional suppression. It's structural reduction. The most effective traders I've observed don't trust themselves in the moment. They trust what they built beforehand. That's not pessimism. That's precision. They assume that under pressure, the mind will negotiate. So they remove negotiation from the system. This starts with fixed risk parameters that are non-contextual, not daily adjustments, not based on feel. Fixed. Position size determined before the session. Maximum risk defined before opportunity appears. Once those are set, they are not revisited. Not because they can't change, but because change requires distance from the moment. That distance matters. I personally found that my cleanest execution came when I stopped asking, does this make sense? That question invites justification. Instead, the question became binary. Does this fit the framework or not? No shades of gray. That framework doesn't need to be complex. In fact, complexity increases justification. A simple strategy context works best. One setup, one condition, one invalidation, not because it's optimal, but because it's restrictive. The strategy exists to protect discipline, not to extract opportunity. It defines when not to trade more clearly than when to trade. That's the key. When risk justification appears, it's often because the strategy allows too much room, too many variables, too much interpretation. Simplification tightens behavior. It reduces the surface area for rationalization. Another important control mechanism is pre-commitment. Decisions made ahead of time carry less emotional weight. You're not deciding under uncertainty. You're executing under constraint. This is why checklists work, not as reminders, but as gates. If a condition isn't met, the trade doesn't happen. No explanation required. No internal debate. Justification hates gates. It needs open doors. Finally, control requires accepting something uncomfortable. You will miss trades. Clean ones, obvious ones, and your mind will justify taking them. That's when structure is tested. Not during chaos, but during clarity. Restraint in obvious moments is the real signal of control. Because justification feels strongest when opportunity looks perfect. That's where discipline either holds or reveals itself. The goal isn't to eliminate justification entirely. That's unrealistic. The goal is to make it powerless, to let the narrative exist without authority, to hear the argument and still be unable to act. That's control, not emotional calm, not confidence, constraint. When risk is justified, it's already too late. The work happens before the moment arrives. Build for that moment and let the system say no, even when the mind says yes. If this perspective resonates, you may want to stay connected. Subscribing quietly supports content built for traders who value structure over impulse. This is Layer Trader,